A week or so ago, I made a decision that still makes me feel dirty looking back. I bought the Soul Calibur 6 season passes. Lots of cool new characters, editor parts, arenas, yada yada, all the goodies. Included with the passes, I also found a bunch of new chapters for the Soul Chronicle mode, to my pleasant surprise. And since I haven't touched the game in a while, I kinda decided to go through the whole story again, just to see if it's as mediocre as I remembered. Soul Calibur games have a bit of a reputation for being financed through friendly handshakes and the spare change that the CEO of Namco finds behind the sofa. It's a profitable brand, otherwise we wouldn't be getting a new game very soon. But it's profitable on a much lower scale compared to other famous fighting game brands. One of the most obvious signs of this saga's restrictive budgeting can be immediately noticed if you play Soul Calibur 4 in 2008 and PS3 and Soul Calibur 6 10 years later on a better hardware, one after the other. Soul Calibur 4 is still stunning to look at, one of the most attractive games of that generation of consoles. So in a way Namco may consider that chapter a long-term investment, given how much of it was recycled for the two sequels when it came to model geometry, mechanics, editor assets and animations. Not that I have anything against this approach, I like Yakuza, or now it's called Like a Dragon, and those games tend to recycle a lot, to say the least. What worked in 2008 still looks great in higher resolution and more refined textures. But it's clear that this is a measure of necessity and not a conscious choice. Back to the topic of this video, the plot of Soul Calibur 6 in Soul Chronicle is told in a rather ambitious way, where every single character, with the exception of a couple of the DLC ones, receives their own little narrative arc, complete with quality voice acting, both in English and Japanese, for every single line of dialogue. Before I went back to Soul Calibur 6, most of my attention when it comes to video games has been dedicated to Dissidia Duodecim, a phenomenal game in its own right, with an absurdly rich amount of single-player content, largely in the form of small campaigns for each playable character. In the case of Dissidia though, this concept is executed in a much better way, both narratively and when it comes to gameplay variety. Not that there is really anything wrong with the plot itself of Soul Calibur 6, on the contrary, overall I do find its writing to be a bit better than that of Duodecim. But in comparison, the aesthetic presentation of the events themselves is so poor that the overall experience ends up greatly suffering. There is about 3 minutes of actual cutscenes in total in the game, with the rest of the story being represented through illustrations of not really good quality. I don't want to knock the artist because you can tell that the guy who drew them is talented, but maybe it's an intentional choice, I don't know, but all of the backgrounds, all of the characters have this very sketchy style that makes it seem like it's incomplete, like they couldn't find the time to properly finish every backdrop, and that's what they had to use. Regardless, even if they were properly drawn, it's still a very cheap presentation, and I want to make it clear that I don't really fault the developers for the game being the way it is aesthetically. The one thing that I cannot forgive though is the general laziness of the gameplay. Soul Calibur 2 and 3 have very good single player modes, offering the kind of content that makes them a selling point, rather than something that is there when you can't play multiplayer for one reason or the other. Even Soul Calibur 4 was created with the intent of having more content before they cut off its legs, for reasons that should be pretty clear by this point. Plus, the concept of each armor part having statistics, like in an RPG, is a very fun concept, and yes, it's very unbalanced, I'm aware, but for a single player game that's not such a big deal. In each of these cases, the single player remains, or would have remained, a gameplay experience that presents elements that are irreplicable in a multiplayer setting. Then of course there is Soul Calibur 5, and if you're familiar with the game's troubled development, then you may also know of that interview where one of the leading developers talked about the story mode being 4 times bigger originally, with each character getting their arc like it would have happened later. Where am I going with this? Unlike Soul Calibur 5, I think its sequel and Soul Chronicles specifically could have been realistically saved from being the way it is. In this video I'm going to put on my game developer hat to theorize how that could be doable. And I'm going to impose a very important condition on this little challenge of mine. I'll try to make as few changes as possible that would require a considerable amount of money and manpower. It would be way too easy for me to say that I'd replace every single slideshow dialogue in the game with actual animated cutscenes, just like it would be easy for me to come up with some new gameplay gimmick to spice things up, or to copy old ones if I feel like it makes sense. What I'll do instead is work with what's already in the game, applying slight but relevant changes where needed, and repositioning stuff that needs repositioning. Now, let's begin. In essence, the gameplay portion of Soul Chronicle consists of regular CPU battles with stipulations that are barely noticeable the few times they are present. Sometimes you have to beat multiple enemies in a row. Sometimes you have to win with a slight debuff, but that's about it. And yes, I'm sorry if you like the Soul Chronicle as it is now, but I kinda find it rather boring compared to the older single player that we were used to. The very first thing I want to achieve is to make the game feel more challenging. For two reasons. The first one is psychological, you could say. I want the players to feel as if the next cutscene they're going to see is a reward for their effort. I don't want them to feel as if the fights are some filler between the dialogue sections, which is often what I felt playing the game in its current state. The second reason is that if you're new to the game and you wanna mess up with the single player before jumping into the online, I don't think this is an appropriate learning experience. I mean, it's technically not supposed to be, I know, but I'd like to think that a good secondary role for Soul Chronicles could be to get people accustomed with the various characters that make up each chapter of the game. The first solution to this problem is to make the CPU smarter, obviously, but it doesn't need to be super smart, just a tad. There will be more other interesting adjustments we can do to increase the difficulty. Way too many fights, for example, just last one round, so we're increasing that to 2 or 3, depending on how important they are. Most fights against multiple opponents will also feature 1 or 2 extra fighters, unless it's inconsistent with the story, of course. As I said earlier, the most complexity out of Soul Chronicle comes from the small stipulations attached to some of the fights. They're hardly noticeable in the majority of said fights, so we're going to increase their effects or add on to them. For example, when you're supposed to start with a reduced health bar, it's going to be lower. Enemies with larger life bar will be harder to take down. Restrictions will involve more game mechanics. Sometimes there can be time limits, or you need to finish a match with a specific action. Stuff like that, to make each fight feel more memorable, and to make each cutscene feel more rewarding when you get to see it. It's not meant to be Dark Souls 2, of course, but I don't want it to feel as if you can turn off your brain until the end of the chapter. Alright, now that the difficulty is at a reasonable level, it's time to take care of the more flavorful elements of the gameplay. First thing I wanna do is create more fights with story-relevant NPCs, both as them and against them. Soul Chronicle is very frustrating in the fact that it introduces all of these non-playable characters, many of which are involved in fights during the story. But for some reason, these fights just happen in cutscenes a lot of the times. I don't understand why the developers didn't just recreate these NPCs with their already immense character editor so that we can see them in actual gameplay. There is entire chapters without a single fight all over this game mode, and more than a few of them feature moments that could easily have been turned into fights. This could not have possibly been taken that much time to implement, and I think it's a massively wasted opportunity. The next couple of changes are a bit more controversial, but hear me out. The Soul Calibur 6 editor has this quirk where like 98% of the character parts are already unlocked, bar a few pieces here and there that you can buy with the game's currency. I never understood that. What I would do instead is make more parts locked away from the start, like 20-30%, not too many out of the total. But once you beat each chapter, a few of them will get unlocked, usually the ones worn by the NPCs you meet during the chapter. And if you only care about online play and creating wacky characters, at the beginning of each chapter you can see the rewards you get for beating it, so that you don't have to go through all of them to find parts that you might be interested in. The reason I want to do this is to give players extra incentive to play, since most people don't care about the museum stuff you get after beating the game. And if they do care about it, they can read it from a wiki. It's not really a great reward in my opinion. And the last thing I wanna do is cut some of the fat. Since Soul Chronicle is already long enough as is, and all the changes I made will increase it by a decent amount, I think it's fair to say some of the hundreds of fights against nameless goons would come off as a bit redundant if we kept them, so we're getting rid of a bunch of those. And that's that. What do you think? Too much change? Too little? Let me know in the comments. I'm sure if this video gets any kind of traction, there will be some people that will defend Soul Chronicle, or maybe they will ask about Libra of Soul. I'm not talking about Libra of Soul because it's kinda boring. Libra of Soul is conceptually fine, but yeah, that's it. Goodbye everyone. I will be posting a trailer for Trauma Pro Wrestling in the future, so be on the lookout for that.